and welcome to this second session about good practice when supporting PDA learners. As you can see from this slide, we use the term collaborative approaches to learning, a term first used by Phil Christie and Ruth Fiedler that highlights the core principles which capture the approach and the style that works best to get those good educational outcomes for PDA learners. So today I'm going to be giving you some further suggestions and ideas to have in your teaching toolkit, remembering these are suggested ideas that work much of the time, but obviously need monitoring, reviewing, revisiting, and remembering that what works for one child may not work for another. So this is just a reminder of those key features I talked about in session 1. Remembering it is likely to be the demand, not necessarily the activity, that triggers anxiety and that need for control. If you remember, I talked about the layering and cumulative effects of demands and the high levels of anxiety in the face of, those very ordinary demands, which can often lead to distressed behaviours. And that importantly, demand avoidance is the most significant, but not the only trait. And that some of the features may not be that obvious, due to masking. So whilst understanding PDA is important in terms of highlighting general approaches, the real key is actually a slow process of understanding the child beyond their PDA, seeing their personality, their likes, understanding their interests. So unlocking a path to learning based as much as you can around their strengths and interests, and using those assessment targets more as an overarching guide, really. So it is about what's their personal autism profile like? How does their autism help us understand them? And how does their autism impact on them? So what's their experience? And of course, we're all unique, so there is no one answer. So I wanted to remind everyone just a little bit about the Equality Act of 2010, because that highlights that, schools have a duty to make reasonable adjustments for disabled pupils. They need to take positive steps to ensure that autistic pupils can fully participate in all aspects of school life and make those reasonable adjustments so a child can study. But there is no set definition, is there, for reasonable adjustments? The points on this slide are often seen as a barrier to accommodating PDA children in schools. It can depend on what the child needs, the difference it will make, what the cost is, the practicalities of it, and if the adjustment will affect other pupils' learning. Now, there is no question for PDA students, adjustments will need to be considered, and it can be tough, but it needs to be considered in the way activities, tasks, lessons are presented, a selection of priorities, modifications to their environment, curriculum, timetable, and to be honest, often to school policies and practices, and in particular, a move away from universally set behaviour policies. Remembering that PDA is a spectrum, so it can manifest itself to a greater or lesser degree. So this will be true in terms of those reasonable adjustments. Now, a concern we hear about a lot is, our guidance recommends that teachers, teaching assistants need to be flexible and adaptable because they find those direct instructions difficult. But this is a challenge, isn't it, as TAs, working within the confines, perhaps say, of the national curriculum, with 30 other children in the class. However, they often cope if they are provided with those options. Would you like to do X or Y first? So the expectation is, of course, that they need to do something, but at least giving them a choice can reduce the demand somewhat. And we talk about collaborative learning. So collaboration, problem solving are useful skills for everyone. So no question it's tough, and there will be PDA students who will find a mainstream setting too overwhelming. But actually, taking this question back to your teachers and to your senior leadership team and saying, well, can we offer this flexibility to everyone, is a useful starting point, because these approaches that I talked about last week and this coming session doesn't mean that they'll be so necessarily have a negative effect if they're used with students who don't have PDA. we can't change PDA. We have to work with it. So it is about people's attitude and willingness to learn. So in terms of providing that best education, PDA children may be catered for in a full range of educational placements. But sadly, it's not uncommon for them to be placed in a series of schools as one placement after another breaks down. What we know is choosing and providing the best educational setting is less about designation of an individual school, rather than it is about the commitment and willingness to be flexible and adaptable in meeting the needs of an individual child, and to be honest, the personality of the staff. But this flexibility doesn't mean we're saying lift all expectations, anything goes. It's just about tuning into a young person, knowing how far you can go, when you can push those boundaries, and you can prioritize different areas of learning. Because long term, that's what we want to do. We want to increase their tolerance to expectations and help them with their own aspirations and choices. So it is a strong commitment to inclusion, not expecting the child to simply fit in. And a good starting point is understanding of that young person, get to know them, what works for them, and how to collaborate that learning experience so those opportunities are maximized, and where anxiety and those resultant behavior problems are minimized. And at the bottom there, we've got the national curriculum. As with any pupil, planning a curriculum is necessary to ensure appropriate assessment is in place. And it can be challenging for a range of reasons, which we can't go into today, but you've obviously picked that up from last time's session as well. And all schools are going to have their own system for tracking progress related to the national curriculum. But there is a move, isn't there, to that broader approach to assessment, particularly for pupils with SEN, and that's going to work well for PDA learners. So I really would recommend and encourage people to take a look at the link that Emma's going to put into the chat. This is Barry Carpenter's work around the engagement model, which the Department for Education released in 2020. Now, the guidance describes the formative and summative assessment of children who are not engaged in subject-specific learning. So I think relates quite, well to some of our PDA learners. I'm still talking about the subject of those reasonable adjustments. The demand for fairness is often used as a tool for blocking much needed accommodation in schools. We talk about equality, don't we? But we also need to focus on equity, distributing resources based on needs. And how can we help other children understand that? So what we can do, we can tell children the truth, that a particular child is struggling to regulate because their internal system works differently to them. And that the fun things that they're doing may not actually be fun, but a need. We can teach, as sometimes we often have a head start against other children. Although it doesn't seem fair at the time, for that child, fair is being brought up to the starting line with everyone else. A common concern, again, we hear through training that, we worry that if we respond to a student storming out of the room by offering them a choice, then isn't that giving in to them and teaching them that all they have to do to get out of something is cause a fuss? We think we should refuse to give in to this behavior, and that over time, the young person will learn that we won't tolerate it and will do as they are told eventually. Now, not giving in is effective when the root cause of the refusal is a child not choosing to do something, when they've weighed up the costs and benefits. So behavioural type strategies can be effective because they just alter the balance. But we've all learned with PDA, the root cause of the refusal and those distressed behaviours comes from a place of anxiety. So adding a reward, a sanction, does not reduce anxiety, but reducing demands, offering choices, options does. And used early enough, it can prevent behaviour sort of coming unsafe. And then again, we think, yeah, but what about the overall lesson we're teaching the young person? Aren't we teaching them that kicking off is the way to avoid demands? No, we just need that really careful planning and understanding to teach them that there are more appropriate ways to avoid demands. Now, if we keep pushing until we see unsafe behaviour and it's not safe to carry on with the task, only then are we teaching them that behaviours is the only way to avoid a demand. So we do need to create a holistic, empathetic, nurturing environment where everyone needs are met, is what we're going to, what we hope to aim for. So here are some examples of reasonable adjustments that have been shared with us from a variety of resources. So sensory-wise, a young person had just a piece of blue tack at a desk, underneath just a fiddle toy to concentrate. Another one, a tension band under her chair so she could bounce her legs on. And this young person couldn't cope with the feel of school shirts, so she wore polos instead. And you can remove her blazer at any time without asking permission. She wears a very short skirt because if it brushes at the back of her knee, it feels unbearable to her. And another person, a PE kit rather than uniform every day. And allowing a choice to move to a quiet space in the classroom without having to ask or mention. So sometimes a very discreet sort of refocus card can work okay, or just a little card, post-it which says, I'm okay and not okay, so they can quickly turn it over and show you as the TA that they need to go to that safe place. What works really well is having a 5 or 10 minutes with a key person or a teacher just before school to check in with them, the schedule for the day, and see if there's anything that's worrying them. So you're proactively putting things in place for them. Toilet passes, off timetable for subjects that are problematic, always sat near a door or at the end of a row in class for one young person. And another person didn't have to go to assemblies and to be at the end of a row at any time, that she didn't feel trapped in that situation. I'm sure we all know about ear defenders, but again, sometimes our PDA learners don't want to feel different. So in this school, the whole class had the option of ear defenders. And the teachers would just say, if you need to concentrate, you can go to the box and help yourself. It's another example of it in a secondary school. She was always allowed to sit near a friend in every lesson, so that if she wanted to say anything, she could tell her friend if she needed anything. And another example, when the rest of the class had supervised study or free time or period, if it falls at the beginning or the end of the day, she could go home early or she could stay at home. And when we're looking at that choice of flexibility, some other things you can sort of think about, which doesn't affect any of the other young people, can they choose their own seat in the classroom? And this example, that in lessons, teachers didn't force this child to interact, and they can't move her to a different seat in the class without good reason. But they also offer the choice of doing presentations to the whole class, or in break, or just to the teacher. So there's those options again. That flexibility in accessing lessons. Do they want to do it online or in a different room? And we talk about personalized timetables. So this young boy didn't have to go into lessons he found stressful. He worked on the computers in a different area of the school. He didn't have to go to assembly because it was too much for him. And he was allowed to leave 5 minutes early to get home. And this last example, for this young person, when the class had double period, she was required to be in on the first half of the lesson, but she can excuse herself and work from the quiet of the library for the second half. And all teachers knew that they had to concentrate the learning part in the first half of the lesson and be prepared to give her some work to take away if she requests to leave in the second half. So again, it would be great if anybody wanted to put in the chat any other examples they want to add to that. Just want to talk a little bit about educational healthcare plans, because some of you will have young people with these plans. It is helpful if children have got the EHCP to think about that supporting information you might have for each student. Because as we know, diagnosis is difficult to get, so it is focusing on need to understand the child. So if you see statements such as the ones on the slide now, so autism with traits of demand avoidance, characterized by extreme demand avoidance, autism subtype PDA, this should signpost you that's highly likely that you're going to have to make some of these adjustments to accommodate that young person. But this is going to look very different to your other autistic learners. But I'm not saying here a child will meet the diagnostic criteria, but just adapting my teaching style to those suggested for PDA learners was actually beneficial to many of the autistic children I was teaching. So whether they have an education healthcare plan or not, with all students, a one-page profile on how to support is really beneficial. We're going to put a link in later on for some ideas there, if you haven't got one already. But the other link that I suggest you really look at is the link at the bottom of the slide. We've got an education healthcare plan guide on our website, which is very PDA friendly. So strongly recommend you download, not just for those who have got an EHCP, but when you are planning with your teacher any individual education targets, this document is very much in a sort of PDA friendly way. So it might help you with getting the right sort of target friendly language down. Okay, so obviously we need to now think about how might a PDA learner present in the classroom. Now, actually, there is no clearly defined way in which they will present, but they may not present in the way that makes you suspect autism even, or the degree of support, because that will vary, as do those other factors, you know, their personality, their intelligence, their interests, those co-occurring conditions they may well have. But certainly in educational settings, it's important that you're aware of any previous educational history, which could well have been disruptive, which can then make them very untrusting of us in school and the staff. And that's where you have to sort of come in and build up that trust. So certainly do your homework about any previous school placements. Now, what also could be confusing is a child's demand avoidance can vary at different times with different people and at different stages of their lives. I think it's almost always the case, though, that a child's demand avoidance will cause them to function below their potential for much of the time. So if you have a child you know or suspect is PDA, either come into your provision or in your provision, what will be important is unlikely they're just going to learn to fit in to your regime. So learn about their educational history, what's worked, what's not worked for them, so you can get that effective transition into school. So that's that collaboration with the young person, with the family, and any other agencies as well. Now, what you will see is a very, very spiky profile, which I'm sure all of you have heard about, but can be quite elaborate with our PDAs. And this is both cognitively, socially, emotionally. So they'll have different sets of needs that need to be considered. So strengths in some areas, but other areas where they're going to find things more difficult. But their ability to complete a task is often about far more than just that academic ability. So that's where that understanding of them, how their PDA manifests itself, is really important. A true understanding of their neurodiversity, trying to see things from their perspective with that empathetic response. And I'm just going to give you this quote from one of my learners. She says, in mainstream, I was classed as the most intelligent child in the class, and therefore the expectation was that all of these other measures should be equally high. In reality, writing was almost impossible due to my PDA profile. My processing was slow, my executive functioning skills were extremely poor, my demand avoidance was high, and I could only concentrate for very small amounts of time. And remembering they are driven by the need to be in control and ultimately have some autonomy in the way they learn to increase that certainty and to reduce anxiety. So our job is very much about exploring and guiding. It's about negotiating with them, suggesting rather than expected participation. Many PDAs will have very poor self-esteem, often believing that they're not good enough as they can't easily undertake what others see just as normal activities. So that they feel really frustrated, but that can develop into sort of more serious situations. So therefore, our job really, in terms of supporting, is to try and reduce the I can't to either I can or I can't do it yet, to reduce that feeling of failure. And this can be done by working collaboratively with them. But they will have very, very poor self-regulation. Sadly, they tend to be children that struggle with structured lessons on emotions. And I don't know if this is your experience, but they often put the blame back on me, saying, if you told me, I wouldn't have done that, or, you shouldn't have said that, and I wouldn't have done this. But you can help them develop an emotional regulation and giving them coping strategies. So guiding them in those techniques, exploring a range of calming strategies, so they can identify something. It's a bit like saying, well, give it a try. This is what somebody uses. Now, many of you may be using the zones of regulation or the 5-point scale. What I would suggest is try to personalize them and involve the young person in that process. It needs to be fairly indirect, but trying to drip feed how we feel emotionally is going to work well. So modeling those emotions and saying something to the young person, if you can see anxiety building up, oh, you know what? I feel I'm going into the red zone. I think I need some fresh air. I'd love you to come with me. And the other point to remember in terms of emotional regulation is they may need more downtime than the other children. But it's highly probable that your PDA children will not be able to identify or share what emotion they're experiencing and feel confused at times. Remember last session, we talked about poor interoceptive awareness, not knowing how their body feels or acts, so feeling hungry when really they're anxious. So that affects their emotional regulation. So it's important to understand that. So I think before a person can regulate their emotions, it's important to ensure that they can recognize them. So throughout the day, at any opportunity, discuss how you felt when you were anxious and worried and what helps you. You no doubt have some students who are explosive or variable in their behavior, and others that are so quiet they perhaps slip under the radar as a way to avoid demands. And I'll give you another quote from Sally Catt, one of our PDA adult trainers. She says, I was really confused when I read about PDA because all the information was about nightmare children having violent meltdowns. I wasn't like this as a child. I hid my anxiety. So just remembering that anxiety can look like other emotions, just being a bit cocky, the class clown, maybe angry, maybe sad all the time. So the key for you is know your young person's norm. What we do know is that research indicates that PDA individuals have a hierarchy of avoidant techniques. So make sure you know what these are. Put those into any support plans you've got in place. A lot of these young people may be stimming and have that need for stimming. So make sure you know a child's stimming behavior and their sensory needs, and they're all identified in that profile. They are young people who desire to be equal or superior, but perhaps don't actually feel they need to put the effort in. So that reciprocity is key, sort of that feeling of equal partnership, but because they can lack a sense of social identity. They do see themselves as an adult even from a young age. So they'll not see hierarchy, they'll not see authority or age, and that need to feel equal partners. And something I found quite tough, they seem quite ambivalent about success or enjoyment. So we have to find that that motivation ourselves, really. And these are the kids who, where it's typified, those young people who destroy their work on completion, particularly if we compliment it. So this is about, oh God, have I got to do it as well next time? They will have a lack of permanence and a transfer of learning between home and school and from one colleague to a next. So colleagues can feel very de-skilled. What a student will do with one member of staff, another member of staff can't actually get them off the computer or can't get them picking a pen up. So one of the most confusing things I think also about supporting PDA learners is there's some days when they feel able to manage lots of demands and seem able to comply with many of the expectations in the learning environment, but the following hour, day, it can be a completely different story. Learning for these kids is a bit like a real roller coaster. So this is actually part of the course, but it's really important for us to see that this is not a step backwards necessarily or a failure on anyone's part. It was just a tough day for that young person at that time. But I go back to something I said to you in the last session. Always ask yourself, how necessary is it that this demand is complied with? And do they really need to do X or Y? They have extensive need, can have extensive involvement in fantasy and role play. So if that is the case, bring that into your teaching toolkit. So it can be really helpful. So if you've got younger children, role play or using their favorite puppet, game character to explain the importance of staying safe works well. Can have a fun element to the activity and isn't direct. It's that indirect style of teaching. Now, I found writing a social narrative based on their favorite game or character, a footballer, another way of helping them understand and deal with emotions and making it optional for them. So sadly, what we do know is that PDA children have a higher incidence of formal exclusions. Okay, so in these next few slides, we just thought it would be helpful if we could give you some frequently asked questions. So one question we get asked a lot is this one: are there any approaches or classroom adaptations that teachers and TA should consider or that are not suitable? No doubt, it's extremely complex. No question it's tough for us to meet needs in schools. What I would say in terms of adaptation, stay away from those conventional or traditional approaches often recommended for autism, that rigid routine structure, traditional firm boundaries, rewards and consequences, because they can make things worse. Although what we will say, we recognise that many of the ideas, as I said earlier, we suggest for PDA learners could be considered actually for the autistic community as a whole. Now, I did touch on this a little last time, but I just wanted to reinforce again, as it's really helpful if you can try to embed as much as possible this mnemonic that you see on the slide, our PANDA mnemonic, into your school day and into any practices that you can. So, that overall message is, that see that person, explore their interest and engage. So just touching briefly again on picking battles, this is about minimizing rules and prioritizing demands. Empowering learners to take charge of their own learning. You may not be able to provide choice of learning objective itself, because they may be set by somebody else, but you can offer a choice how that objective can be reached, because options are really, really important for PDA students. And thinking about the A in anxiety management, prioritizing demands about the rules we choose to enforce can feel to us quite uncomfortable. We're used to having rules and procedures in place. We're used to, sticking to them. But is the classroom really running smoothly if the needs of the PDA child are not being met? So when you're talking about rules, responsibilities, wherever possible, involve that young person in that discussion. So maybe producing a written list of possible priorities, like sticky notes for the day. So if it's a non-negotiable, that they have to do something, put that at the top and in writing so it cannot be removed. And then there may be some blank sticky notes so the student can add their own priorities. If you see signs of increased anxiety, such as that non-compliance, reduce the demand, don't increase it. Schools can be really proactive by working with parents and preparing personalized, what we call stress support plans. So documents that predict environmental stresses and putting simple techniques in place to avoid them before they happen. This is much better than behavior support plans, which tend to try and get you to change the child's behavior. We have to look at all the environmental modifications that may need to happen. If you haven't already got one in place, a single page passport, with describing key adaptations in bullet points and written from a child's perspective work well. So this is just a one-page document. This gives teachers a sort of a quick glance before and during lessons, because if they're too cumbersome, we don't update them, and more likely, we don't adopt to them. So again, Emma's going to put a link into a student passport template, which I found quite useful. But also, I don't know if we've managed to do it. If you go, just Google on PDA Society website, child profiles, there's a couple of examples in there. I do think this is particularly relevant for those of you working in large secondary schools, which aren't, I suppose, by definition, autism-friendly environments. So that's really where collaboration comes into place. And then looking at negotiation and collaboration, that N, those specialized interests, you're going to be facilitating learning in a way that's accessible for them, but it may not be that every single piece of learning is personalized. And this is where negotiation becomes a factor. So come to that agreement that works for you, for the school, and for that young person. Those who are working with GCSE students, managing your expectations that a student is capable of achieving several GCSEs may need to actually prioritize their emotional well-being. Just prioritize what's important over the next year, what you can let slide and what you let come back to. But then that collaboration with parents will be really important, as well as with the students, because you'll need to work together as a team. What you may find, you need to greatly reduce some of the ordinary everyday demands of life, including personal care. So they'll have room in their, if you like, their emotional demand avoidance to comply with what they see as priority. So for example, they may only be able to do an hour's study leave if they don't have a shower. They may need extra time with their interest. And the D for disguise and manage demands. Talked about this last time, but I think it is quite a challenge. We have to practice this for us to adopt and modify our teaching style to one that's less directive. I talked last time about declarative language. So do make sure you sort of take a look at that again, because this does lower pressure. It gives them an opportunity to hear our thoughts, just opens up that opportunity to problem solve, and telling the child specifically to do something, such as get your books out. So avoid saying to a PDA learner, oh, this is what we're going to do today, or you need to complete this task, because that's not gaining their consent to collaborate with you. It's demanding it. So rather, shall we see what would happen if we did this? Would you like to help me with this? Would you like to try this or that? Then you're trying to engage with them. So other ideas I don't think I mentioned last time. They are curious learners, experimental learners, so leaving materials on the table without drawing attention to them. Allow the child to take the lead. Quizzes, multi-choice questions can work quite well. And then we've got that adaptation, humor, distraction, novelty, all those things. And the key thing with collaborative learning is make sure our expectations are in tune with the young person. But there will come a time when we need someone to carry out a direct instruction or follow a rule without the opportunity to negotiate or compromise. So a useful skill there is to direct responsibility to a higher power, as it implies that you didn't have that responsibility or any control over it. You just have to follow it and have that empathy with the student. What I found really useful is that I created various projects. So projects on pause folders, very useful for you as TAs, really, so they can be completed at a later date or revisited. They're really invaluable. So though project work is not labelled as specific to subject work, it's clear that many opportunities for learning across a range of curriculum areas can take place and can be used wherever the student ends up. So you may be saying now, yeah, but what about the curriculum? So our aim as teaching is to further the skills and knowledge of all children in our class. By using PDA learners' special interests and giving them the opportunity to share their passion, you will be facilitating their learning in a way that's accessible for them. And just to mention that one area which causes huge anxiety is homework. So it would benefit these children if that reasonable adjustment could be that the expectation can be removed. For PDA learners, a school day is full of demands, and if they're masking in school to fit in, to comply, home time is a time to recover. For those who do want to do homework, remember that choice of flexibility. If within your setting it is a priority and non-negotiable, try to think about, can you timetable it just into the school day? Can it be linked to a topic they're interested in? And this question we always get asked, aren't they just getting in their own way? Have they no boundaries? First thing is that the degree of support is likely to vary considerably. So this is where actually that whole school approach is so important. Schools may have quite rigid fixed rules on behaviour policies. So considering how your setting can be adapted to support PDA learners, so taking away the myth of children getting away with things. Certainly we hear people worrying that the flexibility required to meet the needs of PDA learners does not prepare them adequately for adulthood. So people will not make allowances for them later. Therefore, they need to cope with everyday demands. So reminding people that they're not choosing not to comply, they're not able to comply with the demands in the way they've been presented. So what we do know from our PDA community is that they fare better in adulthood if they've been supported and accommodated as children in that low demand environment. They cope better with adulthood. So in terms of taking this knowledge forward to spread that awareness, because that's what you're all here and I'm hoping you're going to do, if you're being pushed back by people not understanding the approach you're suggesting, or saying PDA doesn't exist, or student doesn't have the diagnosis, talk about neurodivergent young people with high anxiety and demand avoidance. So keep the focus on need. If you've got colleagues feeling they are being deliberately difficult, that PDA isn't real, just ask them why they think it's not real and on what basis. Query with them how they might explain what we are seeing and what we know about this profile, which leads you to think PDA. So share that knowledge. So asking staff to think about their child's point of view, trying to see it from their perspective. And again, another regular question, can you tell that a student is choosing to do a behaviour? So I suppose the first step towards this is to remember that behaviour is to communicate. There's that driving emotion underlying the behaviour, some sort of overload, not enough processing time maybe, anxiety over what's coming next, that intolerance, uncertainty I spoke about, and those poor interoception. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is that we only focus on the behaviour, which can be easy to judge as negatively and to label as something that it's not. Oh, they want their own way. They're just lazy. They're just doing it deliberately. So not look for those underlying reasons and triggers. But what this means is, though, that the behaviour we're trying to support will remain the same, as the things that are causing it will also remain the same. So we need to identify those hidden needs that drive the behaviours. There can be an expectation on children to change their behaviour. We need to look for the things that we cannot see and what we can change, whether it's environmentally or the way we teach. Yes, of course they can misbehave. Yes, of course they can be naughty. They can try to avoid things. So it is key that you know the young person really well. Just going back to that example of a child leaving the classroom and asking your team, what need do we think the behaviour is fulfilling? So in terms of any distress behaviour, things you can do to support, because at the moment, this is when they're in that panic attack, this is not a battle to be won or lost, but something to manage. It isn't a learning opportunity, so that we're not going to threaten with sanctions or offer rewards. How you can manage, how we can keep calm will be really key. Obviously, we've got to protect ourselves and keep as low key as possible, but try and see a pattern, a setting, a trigger or an action as to what caused that. So making a note, keeping a diary works really well. So for example, it could be that, say, science causes very high anxiety. They know it's coming and they don't want to do it. Not necessarily because they don't like it, but because for whatever reason, they find something difficult. So they show a behaviour that they know will trigger a teacher's response and perhaps cause them to miss the lesson. So in a way, it could be seen as misbehaving, but really it's the reality of being overwhelmed, not knowing how to manage the situation and communicate this effectively. So once the trigger is known, then ideas can be shared just to make life a bit easier for them and reduce that anxiety. So what are we looking at in terms of ideal school principals? Well, I've just put up a list there. I'm not going to go into all of them, but so going back to the PANDA approaches we talked about, to be honest, many of them are in one sense short term, where we look at the environment, we look at the organisation and the way we relate to young people. This is to reduce their anxiety, help them to feel less pressurised, and in turn more able to the suggestions and expectations that we have of them. So making those improvements, however small, can make an enormous difference to young people who are extremely stressed and reluctant to engage. But what we hope is that this becomes cumulative. As a young person participates more, they become less anxious and more trusting with a wider range of people and in more situations. Then we can think about ways we can help them become more self-aware, better able to communicate their anxieties in an effective way. And just on that point about reflective practice, that's absolutely key to that low arousal approach, that you do find time to have that reflective practice and you look at, what happened previously and if there's anything you can improve on next time or what went wrong. So is that good collaboration with schools and families is key. If a parent only has contact with school when something goes wrong, they just lose that trust. So it's very much about having a proactive rather than a reactive approach. So I'd say in terms of that collaborative approach, let's listen to the parents, certainly listen to the young person. It is about the whole school approach, having that flexibility, look at what's going on underneath the behaviour. So a bit of a change of mindset for some of us. and let go of those any preconceived ideas. And that trust is key to getting those good outcomes. So one piece of advice to finish off, I'd say, is listen to them. So when I asked the student who was doing his school leavers document, I asked him, why were we able to meet his needs? And he just replied, "You just get me." And that's key. So we've just put this slide up again because there is so much information now we've got on our website to support you. So I hope you get a chance to take a look at that, including lots and lots of case studies now and some resources to help you.